With my colleagues, Laura Curtis and Robert Moutry, we put together some notes concerning lobbying bills on the floors of the California Legislature. And in simplistic terms, lobbying the state assembly and state senate floors is similar to lobbying legislative committees, except the scale is obviously much larger. For example, some committees have as few as 5 members, while others have nearly 20 members or more. And as you would assume, most committees in the 40-member Senate have fewer members sitting on them than their counterparts in the 80-member Assembly. And also in contrast, there are 33 Assembly standing committees and 22 Senate standing committees. The 40 senators and 80 assembly members typically are all present when they convene on their respective floors, perhaps with an absentee or two. Many of the members on the floors will not know as much about particular measures because they don't sit on all of the policy committees. And on the floors, members are voting on all bills currently in that house, rather than just the bills that were heard in a committee or more. To make matters more difficult, the timeline is usually compressed, which means that they have more bills to consider in a shorter period of time than when the committees meet to hear and vote on legislative measures. Another factor to consider is higher vote threshold requirements that can be in effect on the floor. In other words, a tax increase bill will require a 2/3 vote on the floors of the Senate and Assembly, but just a simple majority in a policy committee or a fiscal committee. One of the first issues I think to address when a bill is headed to the floor is to identify the likely key players or essential votes and then discuss the bill with those members and their staff. For example, a controversial bill may involve the committee chair, House leadership, and a handful of other key legislators. And you'll want to provide a heads up to those members that the bill's headed to the floor. No one likes surprises in the legislative process. I think this is particularly important for bills that may present a difficult choice. And so that heads up will give them extra time to consider the legislative measure. If you're sponsoring a bill, remember that the bill author and staff have to balance your bill with the other measures that they are working on or voting on as they deal with often a crush of legislative business around key deadlines. And as part of this initial round of visits, you may want to visit a number of offices. And of course, it has to be done usually in a shorter period of time to get to, as opposed to during the committee hearing process. While many legislators will say that they've not taken a position on the measure, they always appreciate an early heads up, and at least you can get a sense perhaps of where that member may vote, or at least some initial thoughts on the measure. And this will help you in determining which legislative offices may need follow-up visits, those who might be sympathetic to the other side of the measure, and certainly those who might want to get an amendment or two to the bill. What sort of stuff should you bring to your lobbying visits? Probably the same things that you brought to your committee lobbying visits. Make sure you have a copy of the bill text, your letter, any fact sheet, perhaps any other things that you cite, press coverage, studies. At least they're available, not necessarily that you'll have to drop them at every legislative office. You may also want to have a list of the votes on the bill in the policy and or fiscal committees. Often legislators or their staff will ask about how their colleagues voted in committee, and so you'll want to have that information handy. It's also helpful to perhaps bring the committee analysis to address any arguments or concerns or perhaps amendments that were suggested in a policy or fiscal committee analysis. And certainly if the floor analysis is available, that you've reviewed it and know any issues which may be raised. Finally, don't forget to bring for yourself a vote card to make some notes regarding a legislator's likely position after your lobby visit, so that you can keep track of votes and also the members and the staff that you visited, and whether you need any follow-up or you promise to answer a question or provide additional information, so that if you need to follow up with an office, you have that readily available. Now, some legislators or their staff may be able to tell you immediately whether the member will be voting for or against a bill, and obviously that's quite helpful. However, even if you don't get an answer at that first meeting, hopefully you'll get some insight or perhaps some direction on where the legislator might be headed on the bill. And again, whether he or she's sympathetic to your arguments or perhaps those of your opposition. And as I mentioned earlier, perhaps they may suggest an amendment or two that might result in securing their vote. As always, be thoughtful and listen intently on any feedback that you get there. And don't let yourself hear what you might want to hear. If concerns are expressed, understand those concerns and whether or not it's something that you can address in, for example, the language on the bill, or is it some sort of philosophical difference of opinion that you simply can't address? And obviously, if you're hearing, for example, the same concern being expressed, you may want to, consider how to do so. There might be some misunderstanding about a provision or the intent on this bill, or perhaps the other side of the bill or argument are raising some good concerns with the measure. And so you and your author may have to consider making amendments to address those concerns. If a legislator's already voted on your measure in committee, it's unlikely that he or she's going to change their position on the floor. Or if the member cast a vote on a similar measure in the past, you ought to be aware of that and remind them of it and see if they have a different opinion, perhaps this go around. Legislators have to have a pretty good rationale for either changing their vote on the floor from a committee vote or even for a prior vote on a similar or the same measure in prior years. So obviously, if the bill language has changed quite substantially, perhaps you want to make that new information or those changes available and see if that'll warrant the legislator changing his or her vote. On a side note, the policy committee consultants in most cases prepare the floor analyses. So again, being intimately aware of what the policy committee suggested, for example, on possible amendments or other concerns or issues that they might have raised in their committee analysis might carry forward to the floor analysis. So be sure to keep the committee staff apprised of any proposed floor amendments. Certainly highlight for them any changes in position for those who supported or opposed the measure after the bill left their committee, so that those types of changes are reflected for the floor. And, take time during your lobbying visits to review your vote count and reevaluate your list of targeted members for your lobbying, and make sure that you're aware as best you can where legislators are going to be. Also identify coalition partners and others who might be helpful in your lobbying efforts on the floor. You might want to have a particular interest group or a constituent or a constituency group weigh in on behalf of your side, and make sure that you mobilize your supporters and be aware what the other side, the opposition, perhaps the other side of the bill or the debate. And in your lobbying pitches, you definitely want to express in a few short sentences the policy, fiscal, and perhaps political aspects of your bill. Address why the legislation is needed, the main arguments in favor, the arguments that they might hear from the other side, for example. Certainly, if the fiscal estimate is significant, perhaps that's of concern. Make sure that you identify where the money's coming from and where it'll be spent, how it'll be spent. Regarding the political aspects, if this is important, perhaps to particular interest groups friendly to the legislator or constituents, or perhaps it's been identified as a particular district item, for example. Every legislator is going to pose to themselves, how will this vote impact my district and impact me as an elected official? The other thing to consider in your floor visits is whether you're going yourself or perhaps you have some colleagues, perhaps part of your lobbying coalition, or maybe you want to bring along a particular interest group or two that might be persuasive to a particular legislator or a constituent or local advocacy group. So you want to work collaboratively with your coalitions and keep them in the loop and regularly updated as to what's going on. And certainly if you're contemplating or actually making any amendments to the bill that might change any party's position on the measure, make sure that you do so. And even if you're not lobbying with other groups, make sure that your coalition partners are getting out there and talking to legislators and staff, and make sure that you have them target, specific legislators, for example. So those, I think, are the main things to be aware of. Don't forget, if you are amending on the floor, for example, at the end of session, you have to worry about the 72-hour in print rule. There are certainly procedural requirements for floor amendments, and they do things a little differently between the Assembly and Senate floors. So make sure you are aware of those deadlines and how the two offices operate with each other. And then when the floor vote nears, if you have a sponsored bill, certainly make sure that your author and his or her staff are aware of your vote card and which of his or her colleagues may be needed a little additional talking to, for example, with controversial bills. There may be some extra work that needs to be done, particularly with your legislative author.